Everyone. Hello. Welcome. Welcome to the International Women's Writing Guild monthly member book spotlight. I am so delighted to be with you here today. I am Kelly DuMar, and I'm on the board of the International Women's Writing Guild. And I'm actually speaking to you at this moment from Boston. It's 2 o'clock here on a wintry afternoon. And my guest, Yun Wei, is just climbing towards bedtime at 8 p.m. in Geneva. And she's across the miles. And this is our first member book spotlight that we have done on sort of primetime international. And I really want to welcome you all from wherever you are across the world to this wonderful conversation. I'm so honored that Yun agreed to come and read her poetry and talk about her poetry and a few more questions about her process and her writing. She's also working on some fiction. And so I will introduce her in just a moment. I just wanted to do a little bit of housekeeping and let you know that the incomparable Marge Hahn, my right-hand woman on this call, you can't see her, but trust me, she's here, there she is. I just want to mention that Marge is going to, following our member book spotlight, is going to be doing what she does so well for the Guild, one of the many hundreds of things she does so well for us, and she's going to be moderating our All Voices open mic, and that will take place directly at 3 o'clock Eastern time, and that would be 2 o'clock Mountain Time. You figure out your time zone, but she's going to be doing that, and 1 o'clock Mountain Time, sorry. And she will be moderating that, so everyone is welcome to stay in and listen at the All Voices open mic. You'll hear International Women's Writing Guild members read their poetry, their fiction, their memoir, their vignettes, whatever they have signed up for 3 minutes. And I believe there is still room in the open mic. If there's anybody here who is an IWWG member and would still like to be added to the open mic, and you've paid your dues and you're a current member, you're welcome to be a presenter in the open mic. Everybody, of course, is welcome to attend. And I'm just going to mention what we have going. You're participating here. I know we can't see all of you, and we can't hear all of you, and you can't see and hear each other. But I just want to remind you, our chat room is a phenomenal place. It's there. It's accessible to you. Everybody has it. I hope you will communicate with each other during this webinar, and that you can ask each other questions, let each other know where you're visiting from right now. And that's also a way you can contact Marge and let her know you want to be added to the open mic if you actually do. And I'm so excited because you're going to also have a chance to ask Yun some questions. And you can do this through the Q&A forum. And if you look at probably the bottom of your Zoom bar, you will see at the very bottom, you'll see a list of icons across the bottom, from mute and stop video, participants, Q&A, etc. Everybody's might be slightly different. So right in the center probably is the Q&A icon. And when you press on that, you can type your question into the Q&A forum, where I will be able to see it, read it, and then ask Yun, and she will be able to answer it. So it's really helpful if you ask your questions, not in the chat room, the ones you have for Yun, but in the Q&A, and we will make sure to attend to them there. And Marge may pop her head in or give me some kind of a signal if there's something that we need to address. But I want to jump in now and welcome our guest. And I'm going to be sharing our screen occasionally with some things, but I'm going to tell you why one of the reasons why I invited Yun to be our special guest as an IWWG member is that she has a poem, the Unpublished Diaries of the Phyla, that is published in BROOKLYN Poets Anthology. And that was published in 2017. And one of the things you'll discover about Yun tonight is what a truly international presence she has in her background. And so I'm not sure that I understand everything, Yun, about where you call home, but I think that's one of the fascinating things about you, and I will definitely want to ask you more. So we're going to hear the poem that's published in the Brooklyn Poets Anthology, but it's not the first poem that I want to get to of yours. And I just want to say a little bit about you for our listeners first. And I'm going to give a tiny formal introduction, and then I'm going to shut up and we'll at least let you say hello. But Yun received her M.F.A. in poetry from Brooklyn College and a bachelor's in international relations from Georgetown University. Her writing awards include the Geneva Literary Prize in both fiction and poetry and Himan Brown Poetry Fellowship. Her writing has appeared in DECOMp magazine, ROANOKE Review, APT, Word Riot, the Brooklyn Review, and other journals. And for the last few years, she's worked on global health in Switzerland, where she consistently failed at mountain sports, but is still alive to tell the tale. So I think that's terrific. And then your unpublished diaries of the Phyla is in the Brooklyn Poets Anthology. And I want to congratulate you also for your very recent Pushcart nomination for Second Child. Welcome, Yun.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, Kelly, I don't know where I call home either. So I think it'll be an interesting conversation. I'm just so honored to be here. I know I can't see everyone who's part of this webinar, but you know, the work that International Women's Writing Guild does is absolutely incredible. So I'm just really excited to have the chance to speak with everyone today.
I think I told you when we were chatting previously that one of the things I would want to know and have you tell a little story, whatever the story is, however small or large it is. Susan Tabergian is a longtime member with us, one of the, I would call her a founding member. She's a literary light, a luminary, someone who has really been a catalytic force drawing so many of us into the Guild over these years and decades. And she's, of course, American and lives in Switzerland and founded the Geneva writing group. So how did you meet Susan? Because I think Susan might be your link to us at the Guild.
Yes, absolutely. I don't know how many just brilliant connections Susan has created just through, you know, the way she is incredibly just warm and generous with her time, with her knowledge, and she really brings people together. So I guess I can start from the beginning. I moved to Geneva here, just across the pond from you, for my job in global health. And I spent the first few months having a bit of a rough time because I really missed New York, you know, and just that writerly scene that I was quite used to. And then I discovered the Geneva Writers Group. And Susan is the head of that group. I think catalytic force is exactly right. I mean, that's how she does everything, really. She's truly a catalytic force. So when I think on my first day, I went to a workshop that she was teaching, and I think I was blown away. And like I said, there's like this incredible knowledge and expertise there, but also an incredible warmth. And she really brings like the best out of everyone. So that was the way it started. And since then, I've been lucky enough, you know, to have her support and encouragement here in Geneva. And that weekend was, I think, the first time I found my, I guess, writerly soul in Geneva again.
Oh my goodness, right.
Yeah. So in that sense, speaking of home, it really made Geneva home for me. And I feel very lucky to know her here.
Joy, I love the way you put that, found your writerly soul in Geneva. You had met Susan. Do you happen to remember what her workshop was about? It was memoir or
oh my goodness. So this is 5 years ago already. So I actually don't remember. I've since taken several of her workshops. But she does teach some brilliant workshops on memoirs, on, I think, writing from dreams, writing from life.
Yes, very Jungian approach to her writing. And yes. So, but about you, so you, I understand, I think were born in China.
Yes.
And
then, so it's a bit of a long story, but so I moved away from China when I was 5 and to Montreal. And there I had quite a hard time with the languages, all the languages that I needed to learn at the time. So, Montreal being French speaking, I went to a French school. I had an English after school program, and on the weekends attended Chinese school. So I was trying to learn several languages at the same time. And actually, my father got me started writing because it was a way for me to sort out all that confusion in my head. So I would write some poems in French. I would write some stories in English. I also, would write a bit of Chinese. And that's really the reason I think I started writing. After that, I also moved to the US. I think it was in middle school. I went to college in DC, worked in New York, and has been working in Geneva for the last 5 years.
Wonderful. But you're also coming back to Brooklyn in the spring, and we'll get to that by the end of the call. So one of the things, as you and I were talking about some thematic things to explore during this call, Roanoke Review, you did an interview with Roanoke Review when they published your poem, Second Child. And it was a poem, it's what I think you would call, it has certainly some political themes in it. And it's about when China changed its one-child policy in 2015. Mm-hmm. Now, my sense is that from looking into the origin of this poem and what you talked about with Roanoke Review was that you wanted to imagine a place where a second child might exist. And I wonder if you might just say a couple of words of your own introduction and then actually read us the poem.
Sure. Well, I think you really picked the core of this poem. So thank you. That's exactly it. I was trying to, because in 2015, they changed from one child to two child, and I started imagining sort of, I am a first child myself, but I could have very easily been a second child. And
are you an only child, Yun? Are you an only child?
No, I have a younger sister, but she was born in Canada.
Okay.
So. So I was just trying to think of, this imaginary world where all the second children are. And I started imagining a bedroom that was realistic, but also abstract, if that makes sense. So I started thinking of details that would be, very familiar for a child's bedroom. So for example, these glow-in-the-dark plastic stars that we put on the ceiling for children. And I started thinking, what if the second child, is maybe even more perceptive than the first, and that child is looking at these stars, these cartoon-shaped stars, and realizing that's really not the shape of stars. That's just what stars look like when you squint at them, at night. And from there, I guess I started thinking of, the body and what it really means to, I guess, exist in the body, and how it's sort of a landscape. So yeah, I think I don't know where some other images really came from. I think with my poetry, it's just a bit unpredictable, to be honest. My own mind is rather unpredictable. But it was both, I think, a poem of protest and a poem of mourning. Because this is having a child, it's the most private, intimate decision that you can make, and it's a huge decision for your future and for your family. But to have that intrusion and have that decision made for you, it's unsettling. So that's sort of where this poem came from, and I think that's all I'll say. And I'll just go ahead and read the poem, and please feel free to interpret what you wish from it.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Yes, so this appeared in ROANOKE review, I think it was at the beginning of last year in 2017. Second Child, Beijing 2015. The second child, a split world later, would have been the first. One matchstick finger on the scenery outside the window, wide open, no screens, before the day. The first to divine that the shape of plastic stars was based on a squint. How dresser drawers are filled with before and after, the future clothes she's supposed to grow into. And so, clenching her fists, she wills her limbs another inch. There is no mirror in the room, because she still thinks of herself as a landscape that fills and empties, changes borders like seasons, condenses to heavier forms, expands, dissolves, a body of water on fire. If she keeps burning, she'll be able to stretch to the open window and place a finger on the wet, wet scenery. Umbrella child, chance child, tomorrow child. We've met before, shaken hands and parted ways before the rain invited itself in.
Thank you. I think from my experience of that poem, and I certainly urge anybody who's listening on the call to feel free to ask a question or respond to Yun, have a comment in response that's put into the forum. The details are so exquisitely drawn that I really find myself, I feel physically inside this poem, as if like I'm able to feel like the speaker is describing me in the poem. In this this matchstick finger is so explicit and it's so perfectly described. And then when it reappears again in the poem and comes back and touches the pane, the window pane, and presses its finger there. So those details help me really feel myself into the body of this poem. And the idea of being in the room and who gets born, when and why, I think is such a fascinating question.
Mm-hmm.
You and I had talked about this wonderful quote that you gave to the Roanoke Review about poetry and politics. If I can read it, if you don't mind. Poetry has the ability to enact the change that politics promise, sometimes even more powerfully because it disrupts your biases, charges up your emotions, and integrates into the chemistry of your thoughts. So you said that about this poem and writing this poem. And as I was hearing you introduce this poem, Yun, I felt also how cross-cultural this poem, the implications of it, the resonance of it are. So I really see how it relates to the one child in China policy, but this idea of reproductive rights being controlled by the state or by anyone is one of these really big political ideas behind here. And so it does seem as if you're really making this political act resonate on a very personal, cross-cultural level.
Well, I think that's the power of poetry, right? I mean, politics and poetry, I think, have this in common. I think they're both obsessed with language. But I think the difference is, and they both promise something to you, and they both deal with, I think, longing and desire. But poetry tends to have the reputation of being closer to the truth. I think out of all of the art forms, I think poetry is often refer to as the one that's telling the truth.
Not necessarily the politicians think that, but
right. Well, see, actually, JFK, I think, you know, there's only been, I think, 3 presidents in U.S. history who have had a poet read at their inauguration, excuse me, and JFK had Robert Frost. And I think after Frost died, JFK gave this incredible speech at Amherst College saying that, you know, politics corrupts and poetry cleanses. And I think that's the potential of poetry. I know it's not always true, but that's the potential. And what you were saying about how it makes it feel very personal for you, like poetry has this ability to, you know, condense the very big ideas into this immediate experience. And I guess that's what I meant when I was speaking to Roanoke Review about that, because it makes you feel the impact of this idea very directly, and hopefully that, you know, engenders some kind of change in your own ideas and your thoughts.
So let me ask you, if you don't mind, a process question. And by the way, somebody asked in the forum if they could have a copy of the quote in the chat room, and I will make sure to make, if that's okay.
I'm putting the link to the Roanoke Review article.
Thank you. Yeah, we definitely want to give the credit to Roanoke for the interview and Yun's quote in there. So thank you, Marge. Okay. And I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought there for 1 second. Oh, I know. I wanted to ask you about process. So in the United States, probably in other states, but let me just speak for the United States right now, a lot of political turmoil, division, a lot of political disruption, schisms. It seems to me a lot of poets, writers being very activated by politics. And I'm curious about your own process as a writer, as a poet. Did you, if you were going to think back on the inspiration, was it a political inspiration that generated, do you think that this generated the poem? Or like, I'm just curious about your process, where your impulses just come from, and maybe the impulse of that particular poem.
I think for this particular one, it didn't start out as anything political, because it is deeply personal to me. I mean, my family obviously was directly affected by this. But I think you're absolutely right. I think since the election, we've seen an explosion of incredible art. And I think there is something about resistance that is this force that makes us create, and it's great to see it channeled, you know, into these forms. Another, I think, poet that I often refer to is Adrienne Rich. I think she's one of the masters of political poems, and she had talked about how, you know, poetry shouldn't just be a vehicle of, you know, complaining or railing against the systems or the institutions. I think the power in it is, as I said before, to put you in that room, I guess, to make it very immediate, and to also disrupt, I think, your preconceptions. So whatever you think your political beliefs are, to, you know, shoot that grain of truth at you, so that you start thinking differently. And this is a place where, you know, I don't really start writing poems thinking I'm going to write this to protest against something very specific. Really, it's more that I think, as Adrienne Rich would say, I'm diving into the wreck. I'm ruminating about what exactly are the implications of something that is happening in this world, and, you know, and then I try to embody it, I try to live it, and then I imagine it on the page. But I think one of the disadvantages that poetry has is that I think it's seen as a bit slow to react, right? I mean, anyone who has submitted to journals knows that send out their poem and see it out about 2 or 3 years
You'll
later.
hear from us in 6 to 9 months, right?
Yeah.
Right. That email, right?
Right. I mean, that was pretty good, actually.
What?
Um,
It's urgent.
yeah, it is urgent, but I think what I love seeing is that there are so many more venues now that put poetry out there very urgently.
Yes.
And with, like, I mean, Rattle has been doing Poets Resist
Right.
for a long time. Writers Resist started after the election. There are all kinds of sites out there, and I'm happy to share a list of them for anyone who is interested. But I think now that's different. Like, I think now that, you know, because people are looking for, I guess, you know, some way of expressing all of these feelings. Like, I think we've all been feeling a lot for the last year. I mean, anger, frustration, grief, pretty much every emotion. And to have something just, you know, voice that perfectly, I think is something that we need right now.
Yes, and how fascinating in your poem that it is an unborn child with a voice. Yes. And yes. Isn't that amazing? And so one of the little disruptions that you talk about, the biases, is in that poem that you're talking about how poetry works, this idea that the stars are the shape that they are, that we can make them and then put them on the ceiling, and that somehow that's the truth of how stars look, rather than that's how they look if you're squinting. So this popping open our thinking so that stars now can have the shape that they may have that isn't our preconceived idea. So that's really, really beautifully said. Thank you for that beautiful clarification. I want to move on and make sure, because I want to make sure to include this poem that I have to admit intimidated me when I looked at it. It's got this intimidating title, The Unpublished Diaries of the Phyla. And I thought, what? Of course, put diaries in a title and I'm right there. You know, I love diaries, because that's the beauty of that. It's like, oh, a diary. That piece invites me in. And so then what the heck is a phyla? And so then I go there. Can you see the screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So and then this poem, Unpublished Diaries of the Phyla, it's about a comet lander, something that happened in November 2014. Okay, thank you. All right. Then I look up, well, what the heck is the comet lander? And it's like a robot, basically. So I'm going to shut up and let you introduce this poem, but I just wanted to admit that it was a poem that I found intimidating that I now find so completely delightful, because once I got inside it and experienced the poem with a little bit of glimpse into what the heck you're talking about. So I just have 1,000 questions about this poem, but I'm going to just shut up. And I wanted the viewers to be able to see. Some of them may know more about comet landers than I do. But just take a look at the picture. And then Yun, would you tell us a little bit about this poem that's published in the Brooklyn Poets Anthology?
Yeah, sure. I'm really excited to be part of the Brooklyn Poets Anthology. I mean, this is the first anthology of its kind, of just, I mean, from, I don't even know what range of time frame, but they've included pretty much representation all across the board, and that really represents, I think, the diverse poets that we have in Brooklyn. Even Walt Whitman was a Brooklyn poet, so it's just really exciting to be a part of this anthology, and I encourage everyone to check it out. There's just some, you know, burning through the page type poetry in this book. So this poem, it first came out with Maudlin House, and just, I think a funny thing, you know, my husband is an engineer, and I don't think he actually gets excited about my poetry, but this one, after it was republished on the European Space Agency's art tribute site to the Rosetta and the Comet Lander, that was when he got excited. So, so with this one, yeah, I think, you know, I just thought about this Comet Lander when I was reading the news, sort of it took years, 10 years for the Rosetta to get there, reach the comet. And then at that point, the comet lander, was sort of launched off and landed there. I know I'm explaining this very unscientifically, and my husband will correct me later, but it's, and then it's just left there, it's there to collect data, but it never comes home.
Yeah.
So of course, I imagine it sort of being this comet lander being stranded on this comet and writing diaries that no one will ever see, that will never really make it home. So again, I guess I was embodying this time a comet lander, really personifying it to the extreme. But I also thought about how there's a certain freedom in that. Being out there alone in space, laughing the way you want, doing what you want. And then also, I guess, what the journey was like and how I would have prepared for it. And then that moment of actually, reaching the destination and knowing that is forever. So I think I'll just go ahead then with the poem.
And I'm going to stop share because I really just want us to hear you read your poem. Okay, so the picture's gone.
Unpublished Diaries of the File. Comet Lander, November 2014. 4 billion miles later, I thirst for a pinch, a hurt, a cough, pin drop on floorboards, anything to break this flameless, lickless nothing streak across. Dust, water, ice will do nicely for a 10-year crave. Brought nothing but tampons and passports for a comet chase. A tensile density, they told me, in crystal cut multiplications. I should have stayed where up, down were severed siblings, where silence lived within its means. But no one would let me laugh the way I do here. Tongue out, loose bones flattened to match the dark glazed scenery. How the cartilage of things glow here. Boundaries can be traced, filled with all the geometry I can remember, except for the shape of arrows and exit. Yes, dust, water, ice feels good between the toes.
Thank you. Again, this wonderful experience for me, and again, I urge anyone on the call, please feel free to give your response in the Q&A. It doesn't have to be a question, just can share a response in the Q&A, and we will get to it. But this seeing the picture, then putting your poem with it was so freeing for me with this experience of the poem and helping me really get embodied in it. I loved looking at the shape of the phyla, how it almost like, okay, so I know I'm projecting and this may have nothing to do with your poem, but you said I could do that. So, so the shape of it was like a diagram of a woman's reproductive system.
Yeah. I did talk about tampons this year, but I
have to say, I love that you talked about the tampons, that this, because I think for me as a woman experiencing your poem, I felt like I could more fully experience your poem because of the tampons, because this was a natural thing that this robot actually had this gendered quality to it that I could really sort of identify with it. You're laughing. But I think for certain, for many poems, if you have this sense that the persona of the speaker is male, or that a woman's body isn't figuring in it in that very pragmatic, practical way. Of course she had to bring tampons.
Right. No, yeah, I think that there is a bit of kind kind of ingrained preconception that like technology tends to be male, right? And I was just excited to break that a little bit with tampons, because I mean, what woman goes on a long journey without that?
Right.
and without your passport? And yeah, maybe I don't know if I realized it at the time, but I'm just I'm really like happy to hear your reaction to that, because you know we are in a place right now where we need more women in technology and science, and I mean, there are all kinds of ways to address that. I mean, whether it's, you know, creating like the talent available for that and also recruiting them. And I think I could go on about that. But yeah, funnily, I really thought of the common lander as female, and I don't know why. And I just thought of her experience.
Yes, thank you.
Arriving in this place.
Somehow this feels revolutionary to me, and it should. But I just want to say, Marge, I see your beautiful face. Do you need me?
Well, I just wanted to share with everybody, but particularly you, Kelly and Yun, because you can't see the chat room or maybe aren't seeing it, that first of all, we've got from Lisbeth Koyman, this poem blew me away. Science fiction meets poetry, nerdy science meets metaphor, feminist politics meets engineering. In the chat, I feel so sad thinking about that comet lander never coming home. It's a beautiful poem, and what a soft rendition for a poet. Childlike robot, delighting in the feeling of the ice water between the toes, poignant, brilliant interspersing of personal and scientific. I got goosebumps. In your first poem, Yun, someone said you brought them to tears. It was Leslie Neustadt you brought to tears.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, this one blew me away. The fact that the poet envisions this machine as a woman left stranded in a faraway asteroid and addressing menstruation issues as such. Leslie Neustadt wrote, "She will change the way I will write poetry."
Oof.
Accomplished.
Oh my goodness. I'm just, well, I mean, I'm blown away by the reaction, you know. But, you know, Jorge Luis Borges said that poetry actually happens in that moment when the reader encounters the words. So to me, that's poetry has been happening right there. And I'm blown away by the reaction and the incredible encouragement. Thank you.
It's no accident we're in the community of the International Women's Writing Guild. And because this is the kind of lovely magic that, and community and sharing and connection that I think typically happens here. All right, let me ask you to please read one more. And this one, I'm going to hear in my own head more spontaneously and with everybody else. But I wonder if what you might like to say in introduction to, we talked about Sky Burial. Yeah, Sky Burial, which is such an entrancing title, I have to say, lovely. And what would you like to tell us or not tell us? I think it's helpful, since we're all sort of experiencing just hearing it. I think it's helpful to have a little bit of orientation so that we can really drink it up to the fullest. So what will you tell us about Sky Burial before you read it?
Sure. Well, it's my most recent poem. So I wrote this one last year. And I do travel a lot, both for work and, you know, and for vacation. In fact, I'm probably more used to being on the plane than not. But I wrote this poem after I visited Tibet for the first time last year. So although I have family in China, you know, going to Tibet is a very complicated business. And I never really found the time to do it. And I finally decided to do it last year when I went to, you know, on my way to visiting my grandparents. And I mean, I don't even know if I can describe that week. I was there with my sister and her friend, and it was just it was such a unique place, and the culture is so authentic. And we happened to be there during a Holy Week. I think it was the birth of Buddha that week. And to see people like young and old, sort of prostrating themselves around the temple, walking miles and miles to the mountains, and seeing the monks in the temples. It just, I still don't know if I've found the right way to capture that. And this poem was sort of my first attempt to do that. So sky burial, as I learned, is actually one of the most common forms of burial there, which is when they, take the body up to the top of a holy mountain, and then there is a special monk who chops up the body and feeds them to the vultures. And when we were there, we saw some vultures, flying around certain mountains, and our guide told us, it's happening right now. So for this poem, I guess I started thinking about, well, I was in a place where, death is really thought of as circular. I mean, it's more about rebirth there. You don't truly die. And the body is something that in the end, it really doesn't matter. Like, that's not where your soul is. So, driving through all of these just vast, bare mountains for a week. I mean, I actually was thinking, I really don't want to die, but, and I was thinking that this like idea of like cutting up the body, I guess I started thinking of applying it to life, and how there are certain like parcels of life, everything that we have to deal with is so vast, and we kind of have to reduce it into smaller pieces to understand it, to treasure it, and to preserve those moments. So that's
smaller pieces to preserve it. We need to chunk it down.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think I'll go ahead now with the poem. Sky Burial. When there has been nothing but the roll of the road, and stones that look like oxen, goats sprouting like stones, I find that I cannot die in these mud and moss mountains. The guide says, a Tibetan funeral practice held on mountaintops where the body is cut and fed to vultures. I say, this cannot be. The last vastness, the last closing. There is still so much to make small. What kind of love or grief could fit inside the plains of a palm? We only get to hold life when cut to size, memories for the pockets, tomorrows charmed at the wrists. Like the husband newly yours driving you to the airport before dawn, or the someday child who will someday ask to be loved a little less. It's not about death, it's about birds and the way they eat. In Tibet, the only birds are carrion, who pull and tear, circle the desert to a close. Back home, I study sparrows who flicker, how they open a crumb to more crumbs, how they perch and peck, because there's so much to make small, still to make mine.
It's breathless. I can't tell you just how nourishing this is to have you reading these poems and letting them really live here in this space. And you read so beautifully, Yun. I mean, your work, it's wonderful to listen to you and to have the experience of your poems, the crumbs, the playing of the hand. Again, I feel like I just go right into my body listening into your poems in ways that, and begin to experience my body in ways that are kind of like little explosions of, ahas. It's really lovely. So I would love to, we are going to open it up. Let me just, there's one question I want to ask you. Might be a little bit of a challenge. I don't know. I hope it's fun. I'm going to ask you one question, and then we're going to go and see. Again, please, if you're there, we'd love to have some comments, either from the chat room or a question. If you want to ask Yun about her process or a specific poem, or where you can get more information about her work, all of that, please feel free to do that. So you travel like crazy. I can tell that, a little glimpse of your life. I can see that you are always on the move. You are passionate about travel. You love travel. You are truly international. You live in many different places. You love to travel. I want to ask you about packing your suitcase. As a woman and as a writer, and any way you want to answer that. So is there a way, like, how do you pack your suitcase? I'm just curious. What do you put in there, and what do you take, and what matters, and what do you hate and love about packing your suitcase?
You know, I actually use a technique that a friend of mine who travels even more than I do, Paul, told me about, which is I actually have a travel drawer. So one of the drawers of my dresser, I put everything in there that I normally take with me when I travel. So it's that way I don't forget a charger or, you know, something. I definitely pack very differently, I guess, when it's for work or, you know, for fun. But oh my goodness, you know, isn't the hardest decision always the clothes? It's that is where I spend my time trying to decide on the clothes. You know, you want it to be for the right weather, and you want to have something cute for the evening, and shoes. So that's the part that takes me a while. And of course, I always do bring a book, a journal, a pen, my laptop, and also my e-reader. I have a very old Nook. I resisted against e-readers for a long time because I have to have the feeling of pages and the smell, and, you know, and moving through like that, the thickness of pages gives you some sense of where you are in that story. But I found that in the end, just with all the traveling, that's the best way. I will bring probably 10 books on that just to have some choices. Something classic, something easy, you know, maybe a bit of nonfiction. But then the one thing I will say, poetry, I always bring the actual book of poetry. I cannot read poetry on an e-reader.
Right.
I think it's just too, I don't know, it's too intimate for me. I have to have it. So yes, I think exactly. And
so now that you've described the process, I know I'm putting you on the spot. Now that you've described, so is there any parallels you might draw to writing poetry for you, between writing poetry and packing your suitcase?
Oh yes, absolutely. Well, I think to writing in general, it's about like what you're consuming in order to produce, right? Like what you're bringing with you to create something. If we compared packing to reading, and then the actual traveling to the writing, because for me, as a rule, I also write fiction, and I cannot read fiction before I write fiction. I always read poetry. And actually, this relates to the workshop I'll be teaching at the Spring Big Apple Conference in April, which is that I find reading poetry really opens up, you know, the rhythms and the texture of the language. And when you're trying to work on a particular voice in your fiction, I find that poetry is perfect for that. Mm-hmm. Instead, and also I think reading nonfiction before I write poetry is very helpful, because nonfiction helps you organize your thoughts. It's really about like lining up your sort of intellectual, you know, thoughts and structuring things and making sure that those ideas are clear. And I think I find that helps me get, I think, the structure of the poem and also the message of the poem clearer.
And you are, thank you. You are working on also a novel right now, are you?
Yes, I am. The never-ending novel, yes.
I believe you started it when you were in college.
Oh, well, I had an original idea in college about it, and I started just writing it, you know, in the middle of the night, and nearly failed my microeconomics class that semester. But then after I was finished with it, I just thought, you know, it's not that good. And then 10 years later, I'm still.
Nobody else on the call has ever had that feeling, Yun. So.
Oh, right. I'm sure everything's always turns out perfectly. But I was still in love with the ideas. I still liked the original, some of the original concepts, but then I completely rewrote it. I mean, character, story, setting, everything, just maintaining some of the core concepts of it. Recently, this past year, so I'm nearing the end of my first draft. It's definitely a grueling endeavor. I think it's as compared to, you know, poetry are like sprints.
Yes.
And the novel is the marathon. So.
Yes. Well, you know, I think I'm so glad you mentioned you are going to be doing an actual in-person, in the flesh workshop for the International Women's Writing Guild. It's worked out so well that we could have you from Geneva, but we're actually going to have you also here in the United States at the Spring Big Apple on April 15th. And which is going to take place at Poets House for the second year. We're going to be at Poets House in Manhattan in New York City, and a wonderful location. And you're going to be presenting one of the workshops, and there's going to be more than one, but yours is going to be called, I believe, What Poetry and Fiction Can Learn from Each Other. And you did mention that a little bit. I just want to let people know that registration for your workshop at Spring Big Apple will open on our website later this week, iwwg.org/events. But there's a comment, I think, in the Q&A, so I'm going to check in on that. Jennifer Johns asked, how do you think being trilingual has contributed to writing poetry and use of imagery? Do you write poetry in other languages?
So like I said, when I first started out, writing as a child, I was trying to sort through, just organize language in my head. I used to, as a kid, I used to write in several languages. But then I think the more time I spent in the US and as I grew up, I think my thought process happens in English now. So that tends to be the language I use to write poetry, because it's just the type of like intellectual exercise you have to do in order to, churn out a poem. I'm just not sure if I can do it in any other language right now. But what I am interested in is this idea of translation. And, when you take two languages like Mandarin and English, which are so different, like how much are you really translating in terms of the meaning? And so there's like the literal meaning, but it's missing all of the nuances, and it's missing like the feeling of it, and I think the experience of that word. So what I'd like to work on more, and I think this is a longer term project, and I've started on a little bit, is I've written a series of poems using Chinese words, and I try to translate them, but through like an experience, rather than, as in I try to make you live the experience of this word in the poem, rather than telling you what it really means. So we'll see how that turns out, but it's definitely something that I want to explore more. So thanks for that question.
Thank you. Natalia says, thank you, Yun. I am privileged to be here. I'm very interested in the poetry and the promise of change. It says something could you say something to this about poetry as a change agent, particularly women's poetry?
Poetry as a change agent. So I think we talked a little bit about this in the beginning, but I can expand it a little more. So like I said, I think what poetry does is it challenges your ideas and your understanding of the world.
Your biases.
In your biases,
this
exactly.
that part really jumps out at me because, so I'm going to read a poem, then maybe I can think about reading and having an experience of a poem as getting at my own biases. That you know what I mean? That I need to look at what my biases are. And that's, you know what I mean? Rather than I want to create the poem all the time that challenges people's biases, but am I going to allow my own to be transformed by poetry?
Right. I guess it's, I'm thinking of it less directly as, you know, I'm going to convince someone who doesn't believe in climate change that climate change exists through a poem. I think it comes at it more indirectly.
Yes.
In that, because I think for me, by definition, poetry should disrupt. It challenges you. It pushes you. It forces you to think when you're trying to make connections, you know, across the lines and across the images. That it kind of rearranges like the chemistry of your thoughts. Because you have to follow that and you have to get your own interpretation out of that.
And I assume you're meaning this, Yun, but I don't want to assume, the disruptive for the writer and the listener or reader as well.
Oh, absolutely. I feel like I'm really dismantling myself when I write.
Yeah.
You know, I do. And you know, my favorite poets, they have this ability to just, I don't know, just turn the direction and the meaning of the poem with a word, right? You go from one line to the next. I'm definitely still trying to learn how to do that effectively because, and I think of, you know, Stephen Dunn or Adrienne Rich, of course, I adore her, but because you have to really kind of cut everything into little pieces and examine it and see how does this connect to that piece. And I think just in that process, you are sort of dismantling your biases because you're questioning everything.
Yes. It's very lovely. But listen, we're starting to accrue a lot of wonderful questions. We're probably not going to have time for them all. But when you mentioned, Mary Alice asks, when you mentioned that you thought your novel in college wasn't very good, how'd you get past that to do this current novel? Would love to know.
What's
the quick and dirty?
Do we ever know if what we write is any good? I don't know. Yeah, I think because I think I was so much less self-conscious back in college, you know, and then going through the M.F.A. and then, you know, trying to get into these big journals and everything, you start thinking a lot about your audience. And that's not always a good thing, I think. I think the first draft just really has to be for you. And then I picked it up thinking, I am still absolutely obsessed with these themes of memory and collective memory and how memory gets manipulated. And I have to do something with it. And that's for me. And that's the first draft. I'm going to just throw everything that I want in there. And then I think with that second draft is when I'll start thinking about the audience. Right. And I start putting myself in the reader's shoes and thinking, how are they experiencing this? And let me restructure it and let me make it work so that what I'm trying to convey is really coming through effectively. Yes. I think the story is coming through. Yeah.
I think that this writer is probably referring in some ways too, thank you, that I think it's a great answer, but about this idea that can be this very harsh self-critic. So how do we just like dismantle the critic voice too? And find our way to, and letting our passion continue to, like that wonderful image of the unborn child in First Child or Second Child, that stretching her limbs. I forget the exact quote. I'm going to look it up. It was so moving. She's just like forcing her limbs forward, you know, and past that resistance. I just want to wrap up with this comment. Lisbeth says, it amazes me the way Yun moves so elegantly from the very personal to the political. As a memoir writer, I struggle with that necessary step, taking the intimate experience to the universal. I'm going to give you a second to say, are there any suggestions that you have to overcome that common ailment of memoir writers? And then we're going to need to wrap up.
Oh, wow. Well, I think I visualize it as kind of having a zoom lens, right? You like when you're at the universal, you're zoomed out all the way. You kind of have
Yes.
that bird's eye view, and then the personal, you're zoomed in all the way. I think that transition is very difficult for all writers.
Yes.
If you can sort of just visualize it a little bit, see it in your mind, the way you talk about very big ideas, and then zoom in into something very personal, that might help.
So get really visualizing the lens and say, I'm going to have the big view, and then I'm going to zoom in for that close up, and
Yes.
really trying to just actually see yourself moving with those pictures.
And don't hesitate in doing it quickly. I think sometimes we get stuck because we're trying to make that transition from the big to the small, and we kind of drag it out too much. Just do it really quickly and see how it turns out.
Wonderful. I'm getting encouragement from Marge to take another 5 minutes. Yun, could we impose on you for 5 more minutes?
Of course. And this is way before my bedtime, so.
Okay, good. Thank you. So let me just make sure I'm getting the right answer. Question, what is your writing process, and when and how do you write?
So I do work full time, and like I said, I do often travel for work. So I am a bit pressed for time, most of the time, I would say. I am a night owl, though, I have to say. So I think it's at night that I get my best ideas, and I tend to wake up in the middle of the night, and I keep a journal, on my nightstand to make sure that I write those down. I think what has changed for me from, back when I was in college, for example, and doing this, is that I think because I'm so limited on time, and I'm sure people who have very busy lives, whether they're parents or, have demanding jobs, can relate to, is that you just have to do a little bit of it every day and keep that discipline up, keep up that routine, even if what you write that day is absolutely terrible, because eventually something good will come out. So I write about an hour at the end of the night at least, and if I can go a little further, if I have more time, I do that. But yeah, that's I just try to be disciplined. And I don't remember who it was who said that, it's one part talent, the other part is discipline, and I firmly believe in that.
Yes.
Because if you only wrote when you were inspired, it's hard to get a lot done.
Exactly. So the discipline of it. What Helen is asking, what do you think women will be bringing to poetry/fiction in the next few decades?
Oh, what women in general be? Oh my goodness. Oh.
That's a little question.
Wow. Because I just think making the female perspective the universal perspective.
Wow.
Right? Because so much of literature and art has been shaped in that male perspective, and the female one seems to be more of an anomaly and an exception. And I think part of it is telling really good stories that people can relate to, and not just see it as a woman's story, but this is the shared human experience.
So a fairly significant paradigm shift
Yes.
is what you're envisioning from to the female perspective, and not the norm, the default perspective being the male. So your poem, Unpublished Diaries of the Phyla, so such a lovely example of that. Gori, I believe her name is asking, sorry if I didn't get that right, Gori. What aspect of creative expression in poetry would you say you value more, free flow or intellectually deliberated? And so which is more your poetry?
Oh my goodness. Well, I think probably free flow, and I've always sort of gravitated towards that. But when I went through my M.F.A, I studied with Marjorie Relish, who is both an incredible artist and poet. And she actually taught me how to be more intellectual in my poetry. So I think that's something that I'm just trying to balance out more, because the free flow, I think it's for my own just enjoyment and pleasure and feeling free on the page. But I think if you want people to relate to it, you still have to bring that intellectual side to make, that the message, the point of it, I guess, relatable, and so that they can connect to it and that they can be part of the experience too.
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you. Do your poems, Alma asks, do your poems travel in space and land in your mind/heart, or are they birthed from within you?
Through space, and I'm sorry, the question was, do they travel through space and land, or are
do your
they
poems travel in space and land in your mind or heart, or are they birthed from within you?
Oh, wow, I love that question. It's so it's a skill, that question. It's I really don't know. I think you know, I think of maybe probably through space, because if I had to choose between the two, I do think of it as something outside of myself.
Yeah.
That it has, and maybe it's for my own mental health in terms of being able to keep writing. But I think this idea that, you know, that inspiration is coming from somewhere outside of me is both comforting and encouraging. So I would say through space. Yeah.
It is. It was a fascinating question and a wonderful answer. Oh, Yun, you've been so generous with us tonight, and I have to say your poems have just moved me deeply, and your thinking, your sharing about craft and politics, the power of change, all of it has been super, really stimulating to me. And I do have a very strong feeling that to our audience as well. I really appreciate the questions and the comments that everyone has made, and for everyone who has joined the call. I would love to, now Marge has been sharing, I believe, in our chat room, the links that you sent us. But why don't we say them one more time, just so we make sure everybody has them, and Marge will run them in the chat room again if necessary. I believe you said people could follow you on Twitter at...
It's Pomegranate Way.
You don't have to worry about it. She'll write it, but Pomegranate Way. And then you have a website where people can reach you.
Yes, also Pomegranate Way on Blogspot. So I do like pomegranates.
Okay, so just remember that, guys. And the Brooklyn Poets Anthology, I believe you sent also the link where that could be purchased for anyone who would like to purchase it.
Yes.
And Marge will get that back up or circulate that. I want to remind everybody, this amazing experience has been recorded by the Guild and will be compressed and put on our IWWG YouTube website, and the link to that when it's ready in the next day. Marge is excellent about getting it right out and ready for everybody, can be shared. It will be shared through, I believe, through an e-blast to everybody who's on our mailing list, and then will also be referenced on social media. So you will be able to link to it and watch and listen on YouTube, or share it with anyone that you think would really benefit from the call. I know we're going to be heading into our All Voices open mic, and again, I urge you, if you want the opportunity to work with Yun in person, she's going to be at the Spring Big Apple in New York City, April 15th. And I want to mention also, just quickly, since this is our International Women's Writing Guild Digital Village, we are all about Digital Village programming as well as in-person programming. But our next program that will be in our Digital Village is February 21st. It's with our member Paula Scardamalia, and she's going to be doing a webinar, a 90-minute webinar on first pages, seduce your readers from the beginning. And you can learn more about that again at iwwg.org/events. Marge, do you want to jump on for a minute or not to just say goodbye and tell us any last words from the chat room that you might like to know?
Yun, the response to your event has been overwhelming. As someone who's been watching people's responses to our event so far since we launched in mid-October, I mean, I'm just ready to cry. It's awesome. And I'm gonna send you and Kelly the chat room comments so you can read through them. You made such a difference with people today. Thank you for that.
Thank you. I mean, honestly, I have to thank all of you because you've been so generous with me, and I'm honestly, nothing makes me happier than making people cry. I'm just kidding.
Make us laugh.
But what I really mean is, you know, it's just, it's so encouraging to know that there are so many people out there, you know, who share my worries and my concerns about the world and the way, you know, our place in the world as women and as writers. So this has been absolutely the best hour for me, and thank you so much for having me.
And I'll say, Yun, that Katerina Konen wrote Pomegranates, so much to break into small pieces to digest, each one a seed to grow a tree, such a fertile hour.
There's a poem right there.
Yeah.
It's lovely. Thank you.
It's been an honor to be here. I also, around the world, wherever you've been from with us today, we're so glad you've been with us. And a special shout out to Susan Tabergian and our wonderful friends in Geneva. Marge, I'm going to turn it over to you. Take it away.
Right on.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Good night. Good day, wherever you are. Thanks.
Good night.
Bye-bye, everybody.